Mark, I'd love for you to come up here and join me. Well, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be standing here and have the opportunity to sit with Mark and have this conversation. So I know all of us know Mark in different venues and different parts of our industry, but what Mark is really marked for is his innovative, creative seating as well as his furniture pieces. He's been a professor at Pratt Institute for 20 years. He's been designing beautiful chairs for 25 years. We all know him because he's touched us with Bernhardt as well as the Herman Miller collection and with New Craft. And I think the coolest thing about Mark is that the work that he does is very human-centric, and he analyzes what he's creating for the end user. So I'm thrilled today to present to you guys Mark Goetz.
Thank
you. Please sit down.
Okay. So I've worked in many different aspects of furniture design, from wood chairs. I've worked obviously in some metal chairs. I love designing chairs the most, even though I've worked on a lot of conference tables and occasional tables and lounges and things like that. The most difficult of all seating is seating that not only supports the human body, but seating that has some benefit for the human body. So I kind of think of myself as having two different careers. One career is creating all the different products for many different manufacturers. And the other half of my career, at least half of my time, has spent working with Herman Miller on research and development of new concepts that can have unique improvements to human performance, to health positive results. So I've done many explorations of projects that have never seen the light of day. I've worked on research initiatives at universities where we've studied the human body. We've studied things like circulation, alignment, posture, and hopefully the things that you will see in the not so distant future are products that reflect a lifetime of learning that will go into some new seating products in the future.
I think one of the most exciting things when I got to get to know Mark on this level was really his ability to storytell. So we asked him to share with us, as a designer, his evolution into the business of design.
Well, I was thinking when I was a student, and most of my young education, kind of looking out the window on a day like today and seeing beautiful grass and thinking, if I could just have 30 seconds to just sit there, I would appreciate being out of this room. And then I worked for a number of different design firms in the city. I worked for Smart Design, working on product design. I worked at Ralph Applebaum Associates on some of the early exhibits for the Museum of Natural History. And I always wanted to be doing furniture, and then I wanted to do my own furniture. So one day I did a small project and I got paid $5,000, which I thought was plenty of money to quit my job. And I decided to go out on my own because, you know, this was going to hold me for a long time. And I was 24 years old, and I remember envying the strangest things and being regretful of the strangest things. This kind of dates how long ago that was. my boss had a copy machine. So I was like, where am I going to get copies made? living in Brooklyn during 1987, 88, there weren't any Office Maxes or Staples around. It was kind of a different area. And I told Meena the story of envying the strangest situation. I had my drafting table in front of a window, and I looked down on Washington Avenue. So the first chair that I ever designed, which is still on the market with Geiger, was introduced with Brickell Associates, called the Washington Avenue chair. And people had visions of Washington, D.C. and the Capitol, and little did they know it was named after this street in Brooklyn. And I remember just like the first week, just sitting at my table thinking, all right, here we go. Like, I'm going to start my own firm. And sitting at my desk and thinking, I have no one to call. I'm not sure what I'm going to do today. I don't know what I'm going to design. I remember before I called potential clients on the phone, I used to ride a stationary bike to get my heart rate up so that I could have enough courage to talk to someone on the phone, and I'd be like, yes, hello, can I speak to your design director? And I remember seeing a gentleman going to work. He was wearing a suit, he had a briefcase, he had nice shoes, and I thought to myself, look at him. He knows exactly where he's going to go today. He knows exactly what he's going to do. Everything he needs is there in that briefcase. I envy him. So I think that those experiences and the notion of taking a chance and reaching out and getting to know some people and putting yourself out there and sharing ideas became the formulation of my business.
I love that story. So at Perkins+Will, we talk a lot about personal brands. So we all have one. And unless we all share our personal brands with other people, then we're not really being true to who we want to be or who we want to be reflected to be. So I ask you the question because I know you work with a lot of manufacturers, and your chairs represent you. So how would you define your personal brand?
I think first and foremost, the hardest thing to achieve, especially in furniture design, especially seating, is an element of truth. In other words, I think design is so subjective, and it certainly can be regarded with a different eye and a different taste. But when I think of developing a solution to a given problem, I think I would use the analogy of, for example, a ballet dancer, and I've used this before, where if you think of the art form that you're going to see and a performance that you're going to see, one thing that may not be evident is that this was rehearsed and done over and over and over again before before it was ever shared with an audience. When I think of truth, I think of the work of Charles and Raheem's. I think of objects that have been around for a long time, but still remain very contemporary. And I think it's the hardest thing to achieve in my own work. And rather than something that I've sort of nailed and that I can say my personal brand reflects truth, it's a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to get a little silly, but is there something unexpected about you that we don't know? Is there something that you want to share with us, like a secret that only our fun folks here in the A&D community want to know about you?
Well, I talked to Meena earlier this week, and I said, I'm going to lay something on you, and it's a little weird. It's actually not that weird, but my family is, when they see me come home from work, their mouths just drop, and they look like deer in headlights, because they can't believe that very recently I've started cooking. And I'm even a little bit embarrassed to admit how much I'm cooking, but I'm enjoying it very much. And the internet is like teaching me how to cook. So I began cooking because I'm so disappointed in not necessarily the restaurants, but when we get some kind of takeout or I buy something, it either has way too much salt in it, or it's oily, or it's kind of mushy. And so I started taking sort of my favorite foods and Googling them and saying, I wonder if I could make tilapia with a Mediterranean sauce and black olives, and found that I can, and it's like magic. So I have spent so much time designing furniture and learning to design furniture that has always been, I'm somewhat also embarrassed to admit most of my waking thoughts are consumed by chairs, and a lot of conversations that I have are about chairs and my poor family. So this has been kind of this rebirth, and sometimes on a weekend I've actually cooked 4 or 5 meals in one weekend, and my family just looks at me with a little bit of confusion, but they're very happy to eat the results. And my wife just says, you just keep going. You can cook anything you want, just go ahead. But that's something I've been enjoying very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I know it's hard to share things that people wouldn't typically know about you, so thank you. And then also wanted to tell you, thank you for sharing the things that you shared with me on the phone, because I think, like you guys are experiencing now, like when you have a designer that you've admired from a distance, and then you have the opportunity to have these type of conversations with someone, you feel very lucky, and I feel very humble to be able to have these conversations with you and know the person behind and the thought behind this chair that I'm sitting in right now. So I want to say thank you to that. And then the last piece of this is Mark shared with me a story that literally gave me goosebumps, because I'm pretty sure he shared it with his students when he taught his Pratt as well. But I think we titled the story, the purity of sharing. And so I think this is a wonderful story about, as designers, what we choose to share and what we don't choose to share. I know when I'm working in the studio with designers, a lot of designers don't want to share their initial sketches because they don't want to, give it away, or they're not yet finished with something. But when someone is able to kind of openly share with you, I think it just gives you a whole different perspective of that person, and they're almost opening their hearts to you. So I'd love for you to share this with the group.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I did mention this past week is I was remembering I went to Pratt Institute, and I had the good fortune of having Ray Eames visit our class, Isamu Noguchi, and very impactful to me was George Nelson. And I remember I was probably 21 years old and didn't know a lot about George Nelson. And I was so fortunate to meet these people and to hear what they had to say, because all 3 of them passed within 2 years of their visit. And George Nelson said some really great, truthful things, but one of the students asked, what advice would you give a student? And he said something that, as a student, I didn't want to hear. He said, stay humble, because I can't think of anything more useless than an arrogant student. And that's something that stayed with me. I'm like, what? But it's always stayed with me, the idea of humility. And not long after that time, I had a very good friend that I went to Pratt with who studied fashion design. And her sister was the director of education at the National Gallery in Washington. And so as such, she had invited a lot of different dignitaries and speakers and educators from around the world to speak at the National Gallery. So her sister had called one day and said, we're inviting a professor from Moscow to speak at the museum. And she said, okay. And I was recently sharing this story with my wife, and we had a whole conversation about what it meant in the 1980s. You can't compare, maybe even a place like North Korea with what the Soviet Union was like at the time. And there was a lot of fear in the air. There was a lot of just nothingness, like an absence of knowledge about Russia and the people because of communism. Well, she said to my friend, I want to ask you a favor. This man's sister dreams of being a fashion designer. And she has been developing lots of ideas in a sketchbook. And she would like him to bring them from Moscow and share them. He would like to share them with you. So she called me on the phone and she said, you have to come over, you have to come over. And I said, why? And she said, well, there's this man who's coming to my house and I'm here alone and I need you to come here. I don't know what's going on, but he's a professor from Moscow, but he's coming by himself. And I said, for what? And she said, well, his sister dreams of being a fashion designer, on and on. And he's coming on Amtrak to see me. Now, she at the time was a freshman at Pratt, and now my daughter is her age, 19 years old. So I think back with a different type of perspective at a different age. And I said, okay, I'll come over. So I came over and I sat on the couch. And this gentleman came to the door and she buzzed him up and he came into the room and he said, thank you for seeing me. And he had a portfolio in his hand, and he laid the portfolio on her dining room table, and they both sat down. And he opened the folded portfolio, and he took out the first sketch, and he just said, this is an evening gown, and it is something you would wear to a very formal event. And then he turned to the next sketch, and he said, this is a little more casual, and this is something you might wear to work. And then he went through about 25 sketches, and I kind of sat there and I looked out the window, and then I looked over at them, and I thought, and my friend didn't say a word. She just patiently looked at all of the sketches. And when he got to the last sketch, he simply closed the portfolio. And he said, thank you. And she looked at him and she said, I'm so young. I'm a freshman. I don't know what I can do for your sister. And he said, you don't need to do anything. And we were all confused. And he said, she created these drawings and she just wanted to share them with somebody in the United States who was studying fashion design in New York. And that was it. And he said, and now I have, and I thank you. And he left. And I always think of that story when I think, when I'm on a really hard project, and I'm like, why the hell am I doing this? Maybe I could quit. And I think to myself, why do I do what I do? And I think the first part of it is, as a creative person, I think we're driven to create. I mean, there is no why. It's just something that I do. All of my waking hours are around it. All of my thoughts are around it. I'm trying to create something that is really perfect and meaningful and purposeful. But that's only the first part of it. And the second part of it is that we want to share what we create. And when I think of that story where there was no money involved, there was no professional gain, here's somebody with the truest intentions, with the greatest humility, created this, and simply wanted to share it with someone. And it's always been very inspiring to me. So I feel very blessed and fortunate to share some of my stories with you. And I thank you for listening.
So the purity of sharing. So I'd love to put some questions, if anyone has any questions to Mark. I think we'd love to get some, and please feel free.
So, Mark, as a designer and as an entrepreneur and as a business owner, we all sort of look to inspiration in various sources. Sometimes, as you mentioned, it might come from looking out the window and seeing the grass on a beautiful day. Sometimes it comes from music, poetry. Is there a source that you turn to always, or something that you refer to in your past or even in your current life, as opposed to sort of just finding inspiration where it comes?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you pointed out that as an entrepreneur and business person, creative person, where do I seek inspiration? Is it from a variety of places, or is there a source that I often go to? I designed a lot of wooden chairs in my career, and I spent a lot of time looking at wooden chairs, and I know probably more sometimes than I care to admit, different chair forms. I recently told a friend, we were in a store in Brooklyn, and there were chairs that were being made in Vermont, and I said, oh yeah, I know the arm of that chair. And they said, oh, you've seen it? And I told my wife, I've forgotten a lot of people, sadly, but I don't forget chairs. So I've looked at so many different antique stores and sales and flea markets and First Dibs and all these different things. More at this point to jog my memory into things that I really love. I was really fascinated to hear Dolce & Gabbana speak about, they talked about moments in movies that grow, and I think Armani talked about that as well, where they're not just talking about a movie, but they're talking about one instant, one scene. And I've looked at, when I worked with Bernhardt and one of the great creative directors I've ever met in my life, Jerry Helling. And we used to have conversations about good chair movies. And I think, but I do think of places in my mind. I think of glamorous places, or I think, because my furniture is usually pretty quiet so that it can work in places, I try to think of a place that I would love to see my furniture being. And then these days, a lot of my inspiration is when I hear filmmakers talk about making a film, they talk about, the great filmmakers talk about building a film or building a story as you would be building a building out of blocks or bricks. Whenever I've done a project that I'm really proud of, I think of it more as building the project. And I mean, the back may have to do this, or it may have to use this technology, which I have to learn about, or this may have to utilize a certain type of material that I'm unfamiliar, and then I begin to build from that. So projects that I'm doing these days are bigger in terms of criteria, longer in scope, and the one thing I could never take for granted is, you know, when I went through Pratt, especially industrial designers tend to speak about stylists in kind of like a little lesser way. They're like, oh, that's not design, that's style. Having worked my whole career as a designer, I'm just like, if you have an effortless facility with style, you should thank God. You know, it's like, so I think that's part of it is, in other words, putting all the solutions together to a problem does not necessarily give you a beautiful result. So I think my education at Pratt, the strongest thing I learned was taking a pile of stuff and turning it into something beautiful. And I'm very grateful for that education. So.
So what is your favorite material to work with? Is it wood?
I don't actually work with wood myself. So when I design, I went to school, my first semester was for industrial arts education. So I learned a lot about shop equipment, and I did build things younger in my life. I kind of see material like I think of fabric. So when somebody asks me, what fabric do you see us using on your chair? It's almost like dreaming in black and white. The specifier gets to choose the fabric, and the end user, you know, chooses it for its appropriateness in application. So I'm not particularly driven by material, although I love designing wood chairs. I'm always excited to work in any material.
Did you have opportunity to visit shops and see cut-offs of material laying about, and maybe look at it, handle it, and suddenly get some ideas out of it?
Absolutely. I've done quite a bit of work with Cabot Wren, and they have products that they're made in North Carolina. They have been very good at a very basic kind of high quality product, and they've been great for the community, not only to maintain manufacturing in the United States, but they maintain education of craft, which is unusual, certainly 10 years ago in North Carolina. And I remember seeing their cutoff rooms or their frame shops in all the different shapes that we're laying about. And some of it they burn, some of it they re-glue and make new material. I know in the early days when I worked with Bernhardt and they were totally vertically integrated, Bernhardt heated their factories on cutoff. They also made re-glued material for upholstered furniture. They own their own particle board factory. So there was never the idea of waste. Also, I love working with companies that use domestic sustainable hardwoods. And I work with Geiger, I work with Cabot Wren, I've worked with Bernhardt, and the majority of their material is maple. One of the best experiences I think I ever had in this industry was in the early days. I designed a chair that was very difficult for me to communicate on paper. I hand drew it and drew each section of the arm and each section of the back. And I remember growing up as a child, my mother did quilts, and she belonged to a number of quilting circles. And as a child, I remember watching women have conversations during the day, and it was so peaceful. I actually got to work in a prototype shop at Bernhardt where a lot of older gentlemen who had built things their entire life were all carving different aspects of my chair. And I got to sit with them, and they talked about everything under the sun. And when they assembled it, I actually worked with them to sanding the form and sculpting it. In the end, the chair had a very unusual amount of wood in it, and it had a lot of handwork. And when you have a lot of handwork, especially if you're repeating hundreds at a time, sometimes they get sanded differently, sometimes there's problems with consistency and so forth. So in this particular chair, I was sad to report that it never got produced because it was too expensive. And then probably 7 or 8 years went by, 2 or 3 years went by, and a gentleman from the company that manufactures Hans Wegner's furniture saw it, and they looked at it because they wanted to produce it. But then they said, P.P. Movler said, we're committed only to the work of Hans Wegner. And then somebody from Cabot Wren saw it, and there was a technology that they had locally that could CNC the parts. And so they made it. It was called the 10-year chair, and it was the first time Cabot Wren ever won a Best of Neocon Gold on a chair.
But the times caught up with the hand making of that.
Yes, yes, and what's incredible is that those individuals who are so gifted with handwork, had they not instilled that beauty into the chair, the computer's not going to bring it out. And through that experience, I got to know the equipment. That particular manufacturer sold, not Cabot Wren, but the companies with all the computer carving equipment, and they sold to Geiger. And Geiger came to me and said, have you ever worked with this equipment before? And so I said, I'm very familiar with that equipment. And they said, can you design a chair for us utilizing that? And it became the full twist chair, which is in the Herman Miller collection. So. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It was such a treat to hear your story. Thank you, Meena, for interviewing Mark on behalf of
Yeah,
all
thank you,
my
Meena.
pleasure.
Oh, yeah.